Delighted to see so many people here today and joining us at home online. And if you need to recreate this atmosphere at home online, I suggest that you get a comfy seat, a good cup of coffee, and lots of pot plants, and it'll be just like the New York Times Climate Hub. It's been such a pleasure to work with the New York Times. If you've been following any of the content so far, you'll know that they've invested so heavily in this issue that since about 2017, they've had a full-time team of about a dozen journalists covering this. They had 4,000 articles published last year. And it's just such a massive outlet that 8 million subscribers are following this content outside of America. So that's in addition to the American audience. So this is, I think, the foremost media partner in the world to be working with. And as well as that, it is a pleasure to be working with Louise and Summerhouse Media. Summerhouse have done the logistics for the whole 9 days of this. Louise and I have worked in various events before. It's always a pleasure. And when we had the chance to think about what would we do for a day for teachers, that was a wonderful creative challenge. And what we've done today, you'll notice there's not really a lot of changeover time in between the sessions because we had so much content. We thought rather than have big breaks, let's just run it back to back and cover as much as we possibly can in the time that we have. I'm a teacher. I'm horribly biased. I think that education is the most important plank in solving the issues that lie in front of us. And we know that young people today, Generation Z, care about this in a way that no generation has really cared about it before. So we cannot let them down. So our ability to provide what they need in schools depends on teachers engaging with this, learning about it, thinking about the curriculum, thinking about pedagogy, and making sure that we really do our very best by them. So that's really what today is all about. I hope you have a great time. There's loads of content going out on Twitter and social media. Please feel free to share that as much as you possibly can, and I look forward to fielding your questions as the day goes on. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Enjoy the day. Thank you.
So we have our first panel, and I'm delighted to invite Tom Sherrington, who's going to chair this one, and we're looking at partnerships with schools in the Global South. Welcome, Tom, and your guests.
Okay, thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's fantastic to be here, a real privilege to be in this space, and I think we're going to be joined by Saku in a minute up on the screen. My name's Tom Sherrington, and I've been a teacher, a school leader, and now I'm an author. I write books about teaching, and I'm delighted to be invited to this panel and to welcome our panelists. So we've got Samantha Hunt. Hello, Samantha.
Hello.
Samantha is the Deputy Head of Sandhurst School, and as a record of working with schools in Rwanda and various other initiatives to do with education around genocide. We've got David Hope-Jones, Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. We're looking forward to hearing him. And in Finland, Saku Tominen, who's the founder of the 100ed.org, and who's going to talk to us about some of the entrepreneurial areas that he's been supporting and championing in education. In the context of COP26, I think it's an excellent topic to be talking about partnership, North-South partnership. It's part of the context of this conference that we're talking about disparities between the global North and the South, and educational disparities are part of that. And perhaps schools working with other schools, helping children learn from each other, about each other, can help to foster relationships which support wider change. And we're going to look at the mechanics of that. So I invite all our panelists to just give a brief overview to begin with, a sort of 5-minute introduction to their perspective and their experience of working in this area. And I'm going to start by inviting Samantha Hunt to tell us about her experience working in the area of global partnerships. So Samantha, over to you.
Thank you. Like every educational institution, my school, Sandhurst School in Berkshire, is laser focused on supporting young people to achieve the qualifications that they will need for their future. But it's also our firm belief that schools should strive to go much further than that. For the sake of all our futures and the future of our very planet, we need to develop the next generation to have a sense of responsibility as a world citizen. We desperately need tomorrow's leaders to be humans who care deeply about the environment, who respect and value diversity, who are outraged by social injustice and are motivated to act to make the world a more equitable and sustainable place. This has become our aim at Sandhurst School. Many schools in the UK participate in traditional charity fundraising. However, in the main, the children know very little about the causes and individuals that they are fundraising for. I would argue that there is little educational value in such a model. Some might even say that this model risks perpetuating the belief that those of us in the richer countries, all those of us in the richer countries of the world, need to do is to give a few pounds to those in greater need, and we have fulfilled our responsibility. It does nothing also for the dignity of the recipients. At my school, I wanted to develop a wholly different educational model, one which prioritises the building of friendships and therefore respect and understanding between the students at my school and our partners in Africa. We call this programme Reaching Rwanda. In collaboration with an amazing NGO, Survivors Fund, known as SURF, we have connected my students with survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and their dependents. Through SURF, my students have regular opportunities to talk to their Rwandan counterparts via Skype and email. It is wonderful to see them bond over their shared love of simple things like football and exchanging messages of love and support. For many of my students, these bonds last far beyond their time at Sandhurst School. Through the relationships they build with people in Rwanda, my students have had the opportunity to learn firsthand how climate change is having a devastating effect across the globe. Having learned of the challenges they face, many of my students become so invested in the lives of their Rwandan friends that they inevitably want to support their friends to have a better life. Many of my students plan and execute fundraising activities to ensure that their friend has the opportunity to go to school or to receive a cow or a bicycle or even a robust home, which will make their lives a little easier. In fact, collectively, the students at my school have raised in excess of £180,000. And through discussion with survivor groups, we have used that money to renovate and furnish homes in an entire village for survivors and their children. We provided water pumps, farm animals, and educational materials to benefit more than 3,000 people. We have financed more than 40 small businesses in Rwanda, providing an income to more than 100 orphans and widows of the genocide. And our latest achievement is to open an education centre for children, providing free access to tuition in literacy and numeracy, plus the opportunity to enjoy programmes in dance, music, drama, sport and art. Our aim is for the Reaching Rwanda project to provide a lasting legacy and benefit to our friends in Rwanda, and we believe that we have already achieved that aim. My students themselves have undoubtedly learned a great deal from the resilience, dignity and work ethic of their Rwandan friends. But I have other aims for this programme. I want my students to feel enraged that time and time again our world has stood by and done nothing to prevent genocide and the oppression of our fellow human beings. I want to motivate and empower my students to be active upstanders rather than indifferent bystanders whenever they see discrimination, oppression, and environmental injustice in the world. I want them to realise that, whilst as individuals we may not be able to change the entire world, we certainly have the ability to change the entire world of another individual. I want my students to make that effort. My aim through the Reaching Rwanda project is to motivate and empower my students to be the change that they want to see in the world. And in the Kinyarwanda language, Murakoze cyane, thank you very much.
Wow, that's so inspiring. What an incredible story. And I bet your students are they're very lucky and privileged to have that opportunity, but I know that you've invested a lot of your life and your professional career in that project. And it's, for me, sort of sets a bit of a standard for what is possible. But we're going to talk a bit about how people can get started and the sorts of steps that people can take towards that depth and richness of project, which is really very inspiring. I love the idea of teaching children to be enraged. That's not something you hear too often, and it's fantastic. So thank you with that amazing introduction. David, I'm going to hand over to you now to tell us about your perspective on global partnerships.
Grand. Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. What an incredible space that we're in this morning. I slightly worry that friends joining digitally will think that it's just a clever virtual background, but we really are in a room surrounded by real trees. But no, thanks ever so much. Perhaps if I could say a few words about the Scotland-Malawi partnership, which I'm a part of. There's a really unique and special friendship between Scotland and Malawi. It goes back more than 160 years, right back to the travels of Dr. David Livingstone. Today, there's more than 109,000 Scots involved in some sort of connection to Malawi each year. Over twice that number in Malawi, 200,000. My favourite, and I promise my last statistic, Tom, is that 45% of Scots can name a friend or family member with a connection to Malawi. Almost half of all Scots know someone that's involved with Malawi. And it's the rarest of beasts because it's a statistic that you can actually check. And I encourage you to speak to Scots while you're here. Say you were listening to someone banging on about Malawi today, and half the time their eyes will light up and they will tell you about maybe their child's school link or their mum's church link or the Kilimanjaro rice that they're buying or a holiday that they've been on. It's a bilateral relationship that's inspired all Scots and all Malawians to get involved in some form. And as Samantha was saying as well, an integral part of that is pushing back against the sadly too dominant paradigm of aid seen through the lens of pity and of one-way charity, rejecting that and in its place looking to develop bonds of human friendship that are underpinned by mutual understanding and mutual respect, developing genuinely dignified links between our two countries. And for me, the beating heart of that bilateral relationship are the school links, are the educational links, are the youth partnerships between Scotland and Malawi. And the brilliant thing about the sort of youth partnerships is when young people are inspired, Tom, they go and tell people about it. A young person exposed to a brilliant link with Malawi, they'll get on social media or they'll tell their friends, they'll tell their communities, and it has that infectious enthusiasm. You inspire someone like me, I just go home and I just tell my wife, I was quite inspired today, and that's the end of it. But young people, it has that sort of snowballing effect, and that's what's so exciting. So we've got about 200 schools that we represent, and they have partnerships between Scotland and Malawi. And all of those are genuinely two-way, equitable, educational partnerships rather than charitable or development endeavours. And I think in the context of COP26, these sort of educational partnerships are really, really important, because certainly for young Scots, what they offer is the opportunity to see firsthand what climate change is doing now. Climate change in Malawi isn't an abstract concept. It's not something that can be debated. Climate change in Malawi is now, and climate change in Malawi is life and death. The rainy season is shorter, it's harder, it comes down harder, it's harder to predict, the lake levels are dropping. And young people through these 200 school partnerships can talk to young Malawians about what that really means. And I suppose the second point for me is that human connection. That big numbers don't inspire people. Corporate logos don't inspire people. Human stories inspire people. And young people in the global north being able to develop friendships, meaningful friendships with people in the global south. That's what captures people's imaginations. And so I think while the last 20 months of COVID has been difficult for all of us in many different ways, it's presented incredible opportunities for these kind of educational partnerships, because the mass move to digital has allowed us to young people in Scotland and Malawi, or anywhere in the global north and anywhere in the global south, to have conversations, crucially, without having to get on a plane first. And so I think it's an exciting time for these sort of north-south partnerships, and the Scotland-Malawi relationship is continuing to grow and grow. Thanks, Tom.
It's fantastic, and it's exciting to hear that so many schools can be involved. So going from Samantha's individual school to hearing about a sort of large number, and then that connection with one particular country. But of course, then other people will be thinking, what other connections can we make in using the technology? Which is now what I want to bring in Saku Tuominen, who some of you will know from his TED Talks. And he's got this absolutely fantastic website, 100.org. If you go in there, there's this incredible array of projects, global projects that educators have been involved in. And I think, Saku, I'm right in thinking that you're in the middle of your own conference right now in Finland, which is why you're online and not here with us in Glasgow. But welcome to Glasgow virtually. How are you?
I'm doing extremely fine, and greetings from rainy Helsinki. Just like you said, is that I start with apologies. We are having our own annual 100 Innovation Summit, and it's exactly yesterday today. So I would have loved to be there, but unfortunately, I have to be doing exciting things in Helsinki, so it's not all bad. Also, I thank you to New York Times, because just like it was mentioned before, I've been an avid subscriber of the newsletters regarding climate for a couple of years, and I love the work that you are doing, extremely valuable. But briefly, I wanted to bring 3 points. Everyone who has, I'll start with explaining what 100 is doing. What we are trying to do is that we are a global education non-profit based in Helsinki. And what we try to do is that we try to identify impactful and scalable education innovations and then help them spread. And we were releasing our latest collection of these impactful, scalable innovations yesterday, which is freely available to any educator anywhere in the world. And out of these innovations, 75% is non-profit and 57% is coming from Global South. And we've been examining more than 5,000 innovations and try to identify what has potential to work in more than one place. And everyone who has been working with education knows that education is an extremely complex ecosystem. And we all know that we are living in an extremely complex world, meaning is that we are in some sort of odd pre-post-COVID stage, and then we are discussing about climate issues and so forth. So when you are combining complexity with complexity, it's really difficult to make the change happen. So I wanted to make three brief points about how we are approaching this whole issue of global north, global south. First of all is that I think that it's fundamentally important to understand is that where we can meet people educators coming from global south. We all knew that before COVID started, there was a massive need for transformation in global north and in global south. And that need has not disappeared. We still have a need to transform the education. But at the same time, the COVID has been treating educators all over the world, but especially in global south, in a rough hand. And then in global south, there's a need for transformation, but there's a desperate need for recovery. And how do you combine these two? So I think that we have to be able to give funding. We have to understand the complexities and so on. So when doing cooperation, this is the first thing. Then the second thing is that one of the missions behind everything we do in 100 is to give local education innovations a global visibility which they deserve. Because education has been extremely local until COVID. And interestingly, COVID had a silver lining with many, many massive disadvantages as well. And one of them was that for a short moment, education was global. There was so much sharing of the information between countries, between global south, global north. But shockingly, I was having a long discussion yesterday with educators coming from Bhutan. And they said is that that's starting to change. and education is kind of like closing down again, meaning is that many of the free resources are not free anymore because we are kind of like post-COVID and the need is not there anymore. And I think that that's shocking because education should be extremely global, especially when we are discussing about climate education. And then thirdly, I think that we have to be really careful because quite often the global north, global south aspect has been having some kind of like challenges in being slightly patronizing. There's many countries such as Finland who think is that we have the know-how and we want to be giving the know-how to global south. And I think that we should start by listening, really understanding what is happening there. And like I mentioned, is that in our global collection, majority of the innovations is actually coming from global south. And why is that? It's because the need is so huge, the urgency is so huge, and that it's great time for creating education innovations because difficulty is motivating. And I think that especially with the climate change, it's complicated if we are bringing education innovations from global north to global south, when people in global south have a feeling that actually most of the climate change is caused by the global north. And I'm by no means, I'm not kind of like meaning the beautiful examples we heard today, because I really love the work that Samantha and David are doing. But I think that we have to be really humble. We have to be curious when we are kind of like operating with educators from global south. And when I'm asking from them is what is your main message to global north? Is that don't be patronizing. Come to Africa, try to India, try to understand what is the realities and are we doing something that you could be actually learning from us? And I think that that's the crucial. And I'll finish my intro with a beautiful quote from one of the innovators we selected to our global collection, Luis Camargo from OPEPA in Colombia. And he's specializing in regenerative education. And he's saying that the mission is to facilitate learning experiences that help students to fall back in love with nature. And I think that it's a beautiful approach, and it's now used by 130,000 kids in Colombia, and it's spreading in 3 countries. And there's huge amount of examples that actually global north would be learning from as well. So this was my sort of like opening intro.
Thank you, Saki. That's absolutely amazing. I think that's so interesting, the whole perspective there, learning from the global south. And in fact, if there's one thing you take away from listening to this session, is the encouragement to go and look at the 100.org website. It's just extraordinary, actually, just seeing what's going on. I mean, I looked at it a few days ago and thinking, wow, all this stuff is happening, and just knowing about it is inspiring, but also makes you realize that sometimes we're in a bit of a bubble of our own making. So let's just go forward. I mean, we talked in preparing for this about how it links to COP. We could be talking about global partnerships for other reasons, but here we are in a conference around climate change. So how do you feel like climate change comes into the conversation when you're talking to your school in Rwanda and the people and the students at school?
Well, I think first of all it's very useful for my students to have those partnerships, because there we are in leafy Berkshire in the south of England, and in some respects we are protected from the catastrophe that is happening in many other countries of the world, and also our responsibilities towards that and our involvement in that. So actually, by enabling my students to speak directly to young people in a different country who are experiencing a whole range of issues which we are not here in the UK in the main, that really educates my students and makes them see actually the actions that we take here and the disregard that we have for the environment here doesn't just affect us here in the UK. This has a knock-on effect for the whole global climate. So we have a responsibility to everyone else.
And do you think, does this come up directly in the conversations? I suppose you've got this sort of very natural human thing of kids talking about football or what others, sort of just the way they connect. Do you find that this whole issue agenda comes into their conversations, or do you feel you need to inject it to kind of stimulate that conversation?
A little bit of both. Actually, it does come up naturally. So very recently, one of the families that we're working with in Rwanda, there was a torrential rain in Rwanda, and their house was washed away, and they became homeless. And they were therefore able to explain that to my students, and then a whole conversation came about. Why are these torrential rains normal in Rwanda, or are you seeing this becoming worse? So that's, sometimes it happens organically, but sometimes we are also facilitating that conversation to enable my students to talk directly about issues like that with their counterparts in Africa.
That's fantastic. And David, with the Malawi partnerships, is that like a theme in the partnerships, or do you find that it's coming through, or do you again have to stimulate the conversation about climate change?
Yeah, good question. Honestly, the last 5 years, nothing has galvanized these youth links more than the theme of climate action. We're very, very careful never to be setting the agenda in Scotland, very careful not to be saying, this is what we're talking about, or this is what we're doing, or this is what we care about. As has been said so eloquently, it's the humility to stop and listen. It's the humility to stop and ask, what matters to you? What do you want to talk about today? And overwhelmingly, the response from young people in Malawi in the last 3 years has been, we want to talk about climate change. Young people in Malawi and young people in Scotland get it actually far better than your average adults get it. They get the idea that if there's pledges for 2050 or even 2070, the world leaders who are making those pledges are going to be dead by that point. It is the young people's future that we are talking about. Young people get the idea of climate justice. They get the idea that well under 4% of global emissions is coming from the continent of Africa, 1.2 billion people. They get the idea that countries like Malawi have contributed the least to the climate crisis and are suffering now the most. They get that inequality and they want to do something about it. So in answer to your question, we've never had to encourage or steer towards work on climate because young people are so passionate, so articulate, so inspiring on this. Yesterday we had the president of Malawi across in Edinburgh with 3 of his ministers, including the Minister of Education. We were able to use digital. We had 200 people in the room in Edinburgh, but we went live to Lilongwe, where we had 200 young people from right across Malawi to present what they think about climate justice. And I think that's the great opportunity of digital, to be able to amplify those hugely inspiring voices from the global south and show it matters to the young people of Africa, not in the future, it matters now. And that's why we need to not just talk at COP26, we need to act at COP26.
So if you're involved, if your school is involved with a school which has got a partnership arrangement, some sort of infrastructure around it, the technology to make the direct links, it means that you can actually dial in directly to people, hear their perspective, and it becomes part. So imagine the difference between that and just learning about climate change in a couple of assemblies and a textbook and some lessons, which are obviously really important, but to have that in addition, that's such a more deepening experience. So Saku, I mean, what's your sense of it from the innovations that you're promoting with 100? Are many of them related to climate change?
Yeah, if I'm building on what David just said is that I cannot agree more. I think that there's a huge appetite for different kind of climate education, and it's coming especially from the kids. There's a challenge globally that some kids are finding education slightly dismotivating and even meaningless. And I think that when we were asking from our community, which is in over 100 countries, asking from students is that what is the one thing that you would love to add to the curriculum? And 80% of the kids said is that we would love to have more climate education. But when we were asking the same question from educators, that was not the reality. So I think that the gap is not widening because people are getting is that climate crisis is a great way to teach empathy, creativity, global connections, and so on and so on. So I think that there's a huge potential in using climate for improving education. But I think that there's two ways to improve. One is that you are having great resources that any country can use. And actually there's quite a lot of examples of that. World's largest lesson is giving SDG resources translated in 30 languages, active in over 70 countries. Climate Action Project from Australia, 6-week program is used in 130 countries. Eco Schools from Denmark is in 68 countries and so on. So there's beautiful examples of giving resources for teaching climate change and so forth. But also the other thing is that that's the reason why I love so much about the examples that David and Samantha are bringing, is that resources are useful, but even more important is to have genuine cooperation between Global South and Global North. And that's for me the key, and I'm really excited about all of these examples, even though I love the resources as well.
Yeah, I actually really would love to amplify that message to keep sharing. It's so interesting, isn't it, that during a time where people were going online for teaching and just sharing. Even the suggestion that might be regressing is you think, no, let's just keep sharing it, keep that online dialogue going. And the fact that there's so many resources directly related to environmental issues, understanding the science. So just if people were to get started, when you hear your story, Samantha, it's impressive but also daunting. It feels like, wow, imagine, how do we get to that stage? How do we even get started? So let's have a quick wrap up of, if you want to give some advice to a school wanting to get involved in some kind of global partnership, where would they start?
Well, I would think it first of all starts with the understanding that we shouldn't approach this with a level of conceit that we have the answers to give to the Global South. It is about listening. And for us, the main way that has been instrumental in facilitating this project is through our partnership with an NGO, Survivors Fund, who facilitate this for us. So Survivors Fund, the staff there are survivors of the genocide themselves, many of them. They work in Rwanda, they live in Rwanda, they know the issues, and they are able to facilitate those conversations between my school and the people that we're working with. So finding an NGO who shares your aims and your goals and will work with you long term in order to achieve these aims, in my experience, that is absolutely key.
That's fantastic. So you don't try to go it alone?
Yes.
And David, what would be your key tips for people to get going?
Great. I guess first most important point, as everyone has said, partnership, not charity. I mean, I run a charity. Most of the organisations in our network are charities. It's fine as a constitutional status. It's fine as a way of raising money, fundraise, donate to a charity. It is totally unacceptable as a way for organisations in the global north to interact with the global south, because it's laden with long, out-of-date power relationships. Partnership, not charity. That would be my first thing. I guess second would be about looking to learn about each other through conversation, through dialogue. Again, we've talked about the humility to stop and listen, ask open questions about what's useful, and be willing to have critical feedback of, actually, David, that's not useful. We don't want to talk about that. That might make sense in Scotland, but it doesn't make sense in Malawi. So that mutual respect, that mutual understanding, and the humility to listen. And my final point, everyone can do something. I think that's probably my biggest takeaway point. You know, we're all listening to what the world leaders are going to agree or not agree. But the reality is all of us can do something. We can do something differently. And I think if that's done through dignified partnership, through human solidarity, through mutual respect, we can achieve amazing things.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with that. And I just think if it's just, it might start with something small. So one connection, one exchange between some students and some other students, and then it can grow. So it doesn't have to be this an enormous thing. It can just be a small acorn of something which then grows. And Saku, what's your main advice to people wanting to get started in this area?
Well, first of all is that I don't want to be repeating things that David and Samantha said, because I agree fully on each and every sentence, each and every point. And I love what Samantha said, is that it all starts with listening, and I couldn't agree more. I think 2 points. First of all is that I think that we all understood what globalization really means with COVID, meaning is that we can have national borders, but there are things which go across borders, and we need to be solving our challenges together. And I think that we have to deeply understand is that climate crisis is even more global crisis than pandemia, and that calls for a genuine global cooperation, and that should be in the heart of global education in every part of the world. But I would summarize my kind of like tips in 3 words, simple words. First one is that we have to be humble. We have to be humble towards nature. We have to be humble towards climate crisis, and humble towards global north, global south, and so on. Secondly, we have to be curious, which is listening, trying to understand, not pretending, thinking that we know better than someone else, so genuinely listening. And maybe the third point would be optimistic, because there's so much anxiety around climate crisis and so on. And I think that if we are anxious, we can be anxious, but at the same time, we have to be optimistic. We have to believe that we can solve this, because if there is no trust, if there's no hope, then there's nothing. So humbleness, curiosity, and optimism. That would be my key takeaways.
Well, that's fantastic. I think it's so inspiring hearing all 3 of you talk about this issue. And I just suppose at a very very practical level, it's for school leaders and teachers to just have the intention, to think, how could we, in our school community, make a partnership, and to start thinking about it and have it as a goal. Because imagine what that would bring to your school if you could, over time, develop a partnership with some actual real people that you could communicate through technology, which is there in abundance now, and formulate that partnership, strengthen it, and make it part of your school in the way that Samantha has, and the way that David's articulated with the Malawi partnership. And I imagine the difference that would make to your children over time. It would be quite profound, I think. So there's a lot of ideas there, a lot to go away and still research, but the spirit of what everyone has brought to this panel has been fantastic. So thank you so much to Saku in Finland. Thank you for joining us from Helsinki. Thank you, Samantha. And thank you to David. It's been a real pleasure hearing you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone joining us online and in the audience today.